everyone. I'm happy to be here. I'm seeing lots of familiar faces, which is great. But if we haven't met, my name is Kendra Lodewick, as Rob said, and I am the daughter of a mom with type 1 and also the parent of 3 kids with type 1 who were diagnosed at ages 5, 8, and 4, respectively. So we have a lot of years under our belt. And so I love being a part of this community and the parent group, especially because it's really needed and there's a lot of solidarity in community, and I appreciate this. And tonight I'm really excited because we have Dr. Linsey Nicol with us, and she is an endocrinologist at OHSU, working with children with diabetes and endocrine disorders, and also other pediatric bone disorders. But I thought, as a way of introducing her, I might share with you one of the reviews that came in for, oh, and Dr. Nicol is Dr. Mocha at camp. So some of you may be familiar with Dr. Mocha at GCC. And we're really excited for her to share her expertise here. And I thought I would give you a little preview of what we have to come by sharing this review, which says, Dr. Nicol is thoughtful, understanding, and compassionate. She listens intently to everything, making you feel like the most important patient. She is also an expert in her field, keeping up with new research. We are so grateful to her and the extraordinary care we always receive to support my son. So I just want to appreciate that we are getting the benefit of that expertise and compassion tonight. And without further ado, I'll pass it along to you, and we can go from there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it always gives me goosebumps to hear good parent reviews. It means a lot. So, one of the things that I definitely want to get out in front before we kind of start talking is that I designed this talk to be mostly interactive. I don't want to spend the whole time talking because I think everybody comes to these groups with different experiences and has different education gaps and different things that they can share. And so this talk isn't to be all encompassing on like looking at, blood sugar management and highs and lows, but rather to just provide like a structure for us to ask questions on. So I've got, about 10 or 15 slides that I'm going to go through. And then I hope that we can kind of trigger some questions off of those slides and find out what your needs are tonight, what you guys want to talk about. My hope at the end of this talk is that whatever burden you are bearing, looking at sensor data and how hard it is to watch sensor data constantly, I hope that I at least lift a little bit of that burden for you and provide you with some reassurance that there's so many ways that kids with type 1 diabetes can be healthy. So I guess I'm an old timer now. I have been at OHSU for 15 years, and if you count fellowship experience, that's 18 years learning about diabetes. And I've learned so much, and not all of it comes in training. It's just a tremendous amount comes from what parents share with me. And one of the first things I learned as uh, a young doctor was a parent gently explained to me one day that we don't control diabetes. We prefer to talk about managing it. And I think that was such an important turning point for me to really try and meet parents and kids in our type 1 population where they're at and what their needs are. So that was one of the things that I like to share, and I also share with my trainees as well. The title of my talk is quote unquote normalizing highs. I know we also advertise that we could talk about lows too, but I didn't want to go too nerding out on a whole deck of slides. But if anybody wants to talk about low blood sugars, what I've found out from my patient population is that while lows are a part of diabetes, I think many of my families find the most frustrating part about management of this diagnosis is actually the high blood sugars. So now that we have a lot more technology, particularly in sensors, we just have like a real fire hose of information coming at us. And a lot of that information, you're just kind of left with, how do I process this? What do I do with all of this information? And since I started, we didn't have sensors. So the big picture in my experience of all this is this was already happening in the background, what's happening between blood sugar checks. And now we have like a tremendous amount of new numbers, and what we do with it is really still under study and under research, right? So for this evening, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time discussing, what is the physiology behind a high blood sugar. Many of you may have a ton of experience with this already, but I just wanted to share with you how I think about it as a diabetes physician, like what's going on inside of this kid's body, and how do I explain how high blood sugars occur, and more directly how they persist, how they're so hard to get these blood sugars down. And then we can talk about tactics for battling high blood sugars. And many of you, I'm happy to hear how you manage these highs. There's no one right one right way, but there's a lot of different information out there that I think is a little bit helpful, and things that I talk to my families about. And then we're going to go into like understanding sensor data. There's just so much information there. Some of it may be evolving as important information in terms of identifying or stratifying people who are at might be higher risk or lower risk for complications of diabetes. And then honestly, I think the $1,000,000 question in pediatrics is, what is known about blood sugar variability and long-term outcomes. And so I'll go into a little bit about what's known so far in the perspective of research. So I get the honor of having like a 10,000-foot view of people's blood sugars. I think I've probably read thousands of sensor data. And so my experience with it is kind of a, looking at from a huge population standpoint. You look at it from an individual standpoint, and your loved one with type 1 diabetes, and you watch those numbers go up and down all day. I get the privilege of coming in and looking at it from like a pushed back perspective. What are the averages? What's going on? What's a pattern? And so that's my experience that I'm gonna try and pass along. But it's in no way to negate anybody else's experience of their journey of what they've been dealing with. And also anything I talk about today, I just want to make sure that it doesn't trump what you've already talked about or what's important with you and your personal healthcare provider. So what are we up against with the high blood sugars? I put this up as mountain ranges because oftentimes we look at the sensor data, and that's how a lot of families describe it to me, is these rigid peaks and high valleys, or low valleys and high peaks. And often the predominant theme of our discussions is like, how do we level out these blood sugars into more rolling hills? Why do we have so much trouble with this? If we have a carbohydrate ratio, we count our carbs, we give the dose. Why is my, loved one having a high blood sugar? And there are so many variables that go into that, but one of them is just the actual insulin that we use is really, from a physiologic standpoint, quite slow. So I'm like thinking about it, I kind of explain it to my families. It's like putting a dump truck in a race with, the Indy 500, and you imagine like all these, sugar molecules getting loaded in the bloodstream, and you're just trying to gear this dump truck of insulin up to keep up with it. Insulin is, depending on the kid, it might take even 15-20 minutes for it to start to even work in the body. And then oftentimes the peak effect of insulin could be 60 to 90 minutes. And so if you can imagine trying to keep up with carb intake, even if you're pretty diligent about counting those carbs and giving that dose right at the meal start, you probably, in many cases, may be already behind the glycemic rise. And so we're just not there yet. There's a lot of um, companies and that want to make fast, like ultra fast acting insulins. And there are a couple out there on the market, but honestly, in my experience, it hasn't made a really big impact on my patients' blood sugars. So hopefully this is something that will come into development soon, as we'll have additional options for insulin. Um, you probably already know this, but just from experience, but high blood sugars just make you insulin resistant in of themselves. So for example, what I tell my patients, if it takes a unit to drop your blood sugar from 200 to 100, it may take 2 to 3 units to drop your blood sugar from 300 to 200. And so you may have this experience of like, I feel like I'm just dumping insulin into my kiddo and I just can't get their blood sugar down. It's because of the insulin resistant physiology that just occurs with a higher blood sugar. And then there's, of course, all the other variables that control blood sugars in the body. I mean, our bodies are evolved to utilize glucose and carbs, and there is way more than just insulin involved. There's other hormones in the body. Yeah, puberty, of course, estrogen and testosterone make you naturally insulin resistant. In fact, if you take kids that don't have diabetes and you look at their A1C levels, even though their A1Cs still fall within the normal range, you can see a statistical increase in A1C over the puberty time frame. So it's a natural phenomena, and it's probably exaggerated quite a bit in our type 1 families. There's other hormones. So have you noticed that your kid needs a higher carb ratio in the morning? We are naturally quite a bit more insulin resistant in the morning. So, I mean, I think that's designed from an evolutionary standpoint. So if you have, if you're fasting all night, then you have to wake up and go out and hunt for food. You want a lot of counter-regulatory messengers to keep insulin in check so that you don't get hypoglycemic. And then we do see this very commonly in the AM. Carb ratios are much more generous during those time periods. Your kiddo or your loved one may also have stress-induced hyperglycemia. So this is probably controlled by various mechanisms, but it is a natural response for the body that if you're under stress, either like from exercise, you're going to be releasing hormones and other chemicals to make sure that during that time of stress, your blood sugar doesn't drop. And that response is also exaggerated in children who have type 1 diabetes. Adrenaline is one of the things that's brought up sometimes, but there's probably other factors that drive higher blood sugars. A friend of mine and a colleague who has type 1 diabetes says, have you seen the chart 42 factors that affect blood sugars? And I said, no. So I pulled this up, and as you can see, I don't want you to consume all of this, but clearly there are so many different factors that modify blood sugars. And so a vast majority of these don't have control over, unfortunately. But we are, up against a big task. This is what what families have shared with me and what I have learned over the years as techniques to handle highs. You've probably heard about bolusing earlier. That goes back to the fact where the insulin is a little bit slower acting. This is not an easy thing to do, but sometimes I'll encourage families whose kids eat the same thing for breakfast every day and say, okay, hey, why don't you try giving that bolus a little bit early? There are some families, especially my older kids, who really like the extended bolus features on their pump. Both the Tandem and the Omnipod 5 offer some sort of extended way to release insulin. This is particularly helpful for my families who have like a higher fat meal, like pizzas and other things. So if you're interested in learning about that, you can talk to your provider or diabetes educator. But I've had a lot of feedback from families that this has been a helpful part of some of those pump programs. Of course, there's always increasing carb ratios and blood sugar corrections, but there's also some other things, movement after meals, etc. Then there's the kind of category of um, prevention of highs. And this gets a little bit into, well, what are you planning to put in the body? And I know we don't always have control over this. A lot of our older kids are eating independently, but it is something to definitely consider. So there are, as you know already, probably that all carbs are not created equal. I mean, you have a lot of variations in how higher refined carbohydrates will really spike blood sugars. Those with more fiber and less refined have less of an effect. That's because they tend to move through the GI system at a slower pace. So you have a slower release of the blood sugars. Um, so the other one is a lower carb intake at meals. And this is the one that I really try and address with my older kids. Um, I don't think a lot of my teenagers have a lot of awareness about what they're eating. Some do, but some of them could benefit from looking at the types of carbs and how much they're actually taking in. So serving size is also often a really surprising information for people, not realizing how many carbs they're actually eating. Um, Also, there's a general sense of like how many carbs should be included in each meal. And so there's a chart on the type 1 diabetes toolkit, which kind of goes over some general guidelines for number of carbs to take in for a meal. And they're just guidelines. But if you look at them and you're thinking, hey, wow, I feel like most of the time we're hitting 90 grams, or like it might be time to kind of check in on ways in which reducing that carb intake could have a really big impact on glycemic control. And we've seen this in studies that we know for people with type 1 diabetes who adhere to kind of a more or less generous, I should say, carb intake do have less glucose excursions, we'll call them. Like it is much easier to control post-meal blood sugars if we're conscientious about the number of carbs going in. And I have all sorts of comments on that. And I think that there's some um, people who approach this in the extreme, and I'm not advocating for that, but I'm just saying that this is probably, from my experience, going to have the biggest impact on highs, is what's going in the body in the first place. The other thing that I see as a major pattern in my kids is some of my kids who are really good bolsters, and I congratulate them on that. And I just think they're just doing the best that they can. But I can see they're bolstering almost every 30 minutes for like 15, 20, 30 grams of carbs. And then their sugar just goes whoop, and it just stays high for 4 hours. There's just no way to get around a high blood sugar when you're what I call carb clustering. And it happens, and it's okay that it happens. But if it's something that's a frequent event, you might kind of circle back and say, hey, how can we maybe consolidate some of these snacks you're having or incorporate them into another meal? Um, Here's my first myth that I actually had to bust myself when I was first starting. A lot of times we'll walk into a new diagnosis and we'll say, hey, your child has type 1 diabetes, and we make such a big effort in explaining to families this is not your fault, this isn't because of what you fed them. you don't have to be on a diabetes diet. Your child can eat what they want as long as they take insulin with it. And I remember saying that almost verbatim. And that's actually not entirely true. Just going back to somebody with type 1 diabetes cannot eat 90 to 120 grams of carbs of refined sugar at each meal and expect to have good blood sugar outcomes. You just can't. We don't have the insulin and the dosing to manage that type of carb load. And so I say yes and no to this question now, because yes, your loved one should be going to celebratory meals and enjoying Thanksgiving and eating cupcakes at birthday parties. I am not advocating for any of that restriction. Um, but from a general dietary standpoint, and it's something I say to kids who don't have type 1 diabetes, is that you got to go easy on the carb count and the number of refined carbohydrates that you're eating. And that's true for any kid. So I don't advocate for carb restrictions. I just advocate for carb like consciousness and in awareness. Growing kids need carbohydrates to grow. They are really burning through a lot of energy. And so they do need access to those carbs. So I want to kind of
Can I ask a, sorry, can I ask a quick question on that slide there? Your bullet says, um, no to carb restriction, risk of not getting enough insulin. Growing kids need carbs. So do growing kids also need insulin?
Yeah, thanks for pausing me on that. So insulin is actually a growth factor. Okay, so it does a lot of things in the body. I know that we focus on insulin and how it equates with blood sugar management, but insulin is a protein builder and it helps you deposit fat in a normal way in kids' bodies. And so kids need to have access to insulin. And so under really strict carb restrictions, they may not be getting enough access to insulin for the other parts of their normal physiology. And so what you're at risk for is the potential undernourishment and also risk of getting ketotic because you're not preventing fat breakdown. So what are we getting out of sensor data? And I feel like sensors came out and just, for lack of, just barfed a bunch of data on us, and we just had no way of like figuring out what was important and what was not important. And then we gave them to families, and then now there's like, what do I do with all this information? And um, I mean, I started diabetes care before people were on sensors, and we just had pre-meal blood sugars. And so I had to learn, like, what are we supposed to do with the in-between numbers? And I think the idea about sensors when they were initially developed was they were going to be able to provide some sort of safeguard against hypoglycemia. And they actually do a pretty good job of that. The sensors now are accurate enough where they do reduce the risk of hypoglycemia, and they've done a fairly good job with that. They're not perfect, but they're very competent pieces of technology. I think the question is like, now we have our families looking at these post meal or after meal launches of blood sugar into the 250s and 300 range and then come back down. And you're like, well, what does that all mean? And how do I interpret that data? And so I'm going to try and give you some perspective on that, all that information too, and also leave questions also at the end of the talk to maybe talk a little bit more about that. But you probably are getting a report with your diabetes doctor that pulls up something similar to this. And hopefully they've gone over some of these lines and graphs with you so you know kind of what you're looking at. I think again, with diabetes, my perspective as a physician is I'm looking at the big picture. I'll go through the day-to-day data to look for patterns, but what I'm interested in is, what does your big picture look like? And are we on target to get you within range as much as possible? So you'll see green lines, and some of your sensor data will be, your lower range of normal will be 80. Some of my older kids, I'll drop their lower range to 70 as an option to kind of tighten some of their glycemic control. The black line is your average. So it's number of data points per total time, 9 p.m., 12 p.m. What's your average blood sugar? The light blue line is where is your loved one's blood sugar at that particular time, the other 90% of the time. So it has a degree of like how much variation is there. The dark blue section is what's their blood sugar 50% of the time. And so you can see that during times of the day, especially in the afternoon, this is super common when people are eating dinner at various times or there's snacks after school. We see a lot more blood sugar variability during these times because of the timing of the meals and some other factors where kids are, eating at various times. So this spread of blood sugars here in the later afternoons is really common. And then we generally see some lowering of blood sugars overnight when our kids aren't moving or eating. Well, most of them aren't eating overnight. Teenagers are eating a lot overnight, but so what do you do with this data? Well, what do I do with this data? One is I'm kind of interested in the average blood sugar. I like that information. I also like what this term is called GMI, which relates to the glucose management indicator. And that's just a mathematical calculation of what your A1C might look like if you got an A1C. Generally, this number here is going to be most accurate when you have around 90 days of sensor data. It's going to be the closest to an actual A1C. That's because A1Cs are, as you remember, like measured every 3 months, and it's a measurement of how much sugar is actually sticking to your red blood cells. A red blood cell lasts around 90 days and then it's replaced. And so really an A1C is reflecting 90 days of blood sugar average. And so when you're looking at a sensor data, if you want to kind of know what your A1C might be, you want to pull down about 90 days of data. Glucose variability is basically what we're looking at with these broad lines. It'll kind of take the average of how much your child's glucose is varying from their mean blood sugar, how much up and down. I think what's getting more attention now is the kind of time and range age data. So for example, make sure I can stay on time. Time and range meaning, okay, how much time is spent in a 24-hour period between 70 and 180 or between 80 and 180, and then how often are you above that or below that. So that's the general output of a sensor, and the Libre and the Dexcom put out really similar data. So what I almost didn't put this in because I didn't want you to get too caught up in this data. So the next question, right? Well, if I'm wearing a sensor, what am I supposed to be looking at? I would say average blood sugar, and probably what's coming soon is more emphasis on what we're calling time and range, or TIR. And so now there's more clinical studies that are trying to use this type of sensor data to then stratify somebody's risk of complications. So if you have a time and range of X, what's your incidence of Y? And I will tell you right now that unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know what, this is the kind of like the the collective societies like the ADA and the International Society of Pediatric Diabetes have endorsed a time and range of 70% or greater. And I feel like this is a really, really big challenge for me as a provider and also for our families to really be successful at this, especially in pediatrics. And so if you're reading, just a cautionary tale, if you're reading information on internet and blogs and such, the time and range this is what they're referring to, and this is what they're advocating for. And that basically equates to an A1C typically of much less than 7%. And I don't think that that's particularly reasonable for our for the vast majority of our families, particularly our pediatric patients. And then I'm going to come back to that and tell you like why I don't want you hooked on this number as a marker of success for diabetes management, despite it being put out there in the community. So myth number 2, my diabetes doctor expects my child TIR, time and range, to be greater than 70%. No. If it is, great. If it's not, that is not something that I as a physician are going to really get too worried about. And the reason is that it is really a difficult marker to get. And so if you look in adults, the vast majority of adults in the United States with type 1 diabetes, in Europe, less than 10% of adults with type 1 diabetes are able to attain this range, all right? And oftentimes for many people who have type 1 diabetes, especially kids who are at school all day, gym, recess, in the care of other adults, are doing other things or eating at different schedules at different times, may or may not be managing their own diet. The risk of disruptive hypoglycemic events is pretty high in in getting such tight control of getting this type of time and range. Some families can do it, and vast majority can't. I can tell you that I've had one family in the last 2 months meet this marker. So that's my perspective. People in the audience may have other views or perspectives about this. The why I don't get too worried about this is that although it makes obvious sense that a higher A1C and a higher time and range on sensor, or a higher A1C or less, I should say less time on sensor, should mean increased risk of complications, but I can tell you that the vast majority of that data is still in adults. And I think that we have to remember that children are not little adults. They have a huge inertia towards health and healing and growing, and they have a different physiology. So I think that until we get the research that says this kid at 6 years of age needs to be in this TIR to prevent X, Y, or Z at age 50 or 60, we're not going to be able to really say for sure what an accurate goal would be for a child with type 1 diabetes at this point. The other thing too is that my anecdotal experience in supporting parents and patients, and also research shows that even if you put your child in the care of a trained professional such as myself, I'm probably not going to be able to get them into that time of range of greater than 70%. So they actually did a study where they looked at kids who went to diabetes camp and had regimented meals, all the carb counting done for them, and then a trained professional such as somebody like me or a nurse, and they were not able. A lot of blood sugars for kids got better in that environment. Nobody was successful in reaching that goal. So I wouldn't anticipate that this is something that everybody's going to be able to meet. Okay. Myth busting number 3, complications from diabetes depends only on the hemoglobin A1C. there's so much data out there that relates this marker to disease outcomes. And again, I just want to remind everybody that your loved one with type 1 diabetes is their own entity, and it is identifying a risk. It's not an absolute. So it's just like if you're into mountain biking, you're at higher risk of having a collarbone fracture. It doesn't mean that you're going to have it, but so there, it's not so much like this is a destiny of outcome of a child that has an A1C that's higher than what we want. There's so many other factors. There's many people have protective genetics against some of the complications in that are identified in type 1 diabetes. You have also still have a lot of modifiable risk factors: prevention of smoking, maintaining healthy weight. Active children are extremely healthy children. And we just really don't have that data to say if you have these types of blood glucose excursions or an A1C that's slightly elevated from out of our target range, that this is going to be something that's going to be a long-term consequence for your kids, because they are especially apt at healing and recovering. So lastly, the other myth that I want to bring up, and I think this is really important because I know you all talk to each other, and I think that's good, but I don't want you comparing um, diabetes between one or two kids, because not even though a child has the same diagnosis, it's not the same. And I can attest to this because I have some kids with type 1 diabetes. They have all the markers, the antibodies, but their diabetes is different. One in that, so I just have some kids who can dose insulin 3 times a day, 4 times a day. They have those rolling hill blood sugar values. They're not even on a pump. They're still on injections, and they're just able to get that glycemic control with not a lot of interventions. And then we have vast majority of other families that just have those up and down excursions and high blood sugar variability. It's just different. And we think that there may be some kids that sustain some small amount of endogenous or self-made insulin production that provides them some protection. And there's actually studies to show that some people are able to actually maintain some small amount of insulin secretion, even though they still require insulin. And then I just want to put out a shout out to, when you're reading information about type 1 diabetes, be careful about incorporating type 2 into the data. I think a lot of studies put in both of those both of those populations, but type 2 diabetes is a completely different disease, and it's not the same in terms of your risk of complications. So I really want to say, well, just be careful. You might be comparing apples and oranges. So if you hear about something, oh, I have an A1C of 5.9 or 6.2, and you can't achieve that for your kid, there may be something different about that particular kid's diabetes that enables them to get, A1Cs that low. And so I have families across on either spectrum of that. And so I do see it in my practice. I'm going to close out now because I do want to have time for interaction and questions. And I just want to give a shout out to everybody who cares for somebody with type 1 diabetes. You are on average making 180 extra decisions a day. And it's a lot of hard work, and I commend you for it. And all the efforts that you have in taking care of protecting somebody that you love. So I will pause there and open it up to our audience.
We're here because of our granddaughter, who is now 9, and she was diagnosed at 5. And so we've gotten better, definitely, at handling her blood sugar. But I was definitely interested in hearing about lows and, how it always, we took her to the pool when she was the last time visiting us, um, and she went low, and she went the lowest that she's ever, I mean, it just said low on it. And she was, I could see her face. She did not feel good. Um, and so it's such a scary thing. I wonder how low can you go? And I'm sure it varies
Yeah, yeah,
the limbo that I'm
yeah.
talking about, but yeah, how low and how long can it be there?
Mhm.
That's my question.
Yeah, so one thing that I've learned is anything that involves water, whether liquid or frozen, teams, I don't know if you've all had other experiences with this, but is notorious for making or causing or being a cause of low blood sugar. So the fact that you told me it was a swimming event makes sense to me. Um, and so those might be events where you might do a little what I call carb loading beforehand. Swimming, skiing, running in the snow all seem to have an effect on children's blood sugars. The how low you can go, you can go pretty low, okay, and your sensor would probably pick that up, or your glucose meter pick that up. Whether you have a bad outcome for that low depends on how long that low persists. Okay. So the body has a lot of protective mechanisms and warning signs for a low blood sugar that warn you before something gets um, out of your control. And so one of the first things is this kind of adrenaline adrenergic response. And it causes this shakiness and probably an anxiety. And those are the first signs of low blood sugar. And that's a warning that your blood sugar is getting into a range where if it goes any lower, the brain might be affected. Okay, so that trigger usually happens below 70 and goes on to roughly into the 50s. Then your counter regulatory hormones kick in to prevent it from going even lower. So that's things like your cortisol, your adrenaline, some other things will try and protect any further drop. And if you address a low blood sugar at that point in time, it's usually a pretty easy fix. If you kind of go beyond that and it's prolonged, that's when the brain starts losing access to blood sugar. So the brain gets the very last drop of glucose in the body. And so that's why you have all these warning signs beforehand to like address this. I need treatment before something like loss of consciousness or seizure happens. So even though these events are really scary, and they are, you do have time to address it, and you need to address it quickly, especially if you're getting below 40 and you want to make sure that you're not dropping any more. But generally speaking, the loss of consciousness and the seizure activity require that low to be prolonged. And I can't tell you like number of minutes, but you just get a lot of these warning signs ahead of time. So that it's kind of this tiered system of alarms, basically. Yeah, I hope that was a long-winded answer to
No, that was good. That was helpful. Yeah, just, I mean, I was filling her up with glucose gummies and crackers, and I can't even remember what else. She was just, but just to, yeah, hearing those different levels just gives me a little bit better, more, I don't know, confidence isn't quite the right word, but
yeah.
just a better idea.
Yep.
Yeah, so thanks for that.
Um, I have a follow-up question, but I don't want to jump the line. So if I see Eric's hand is up, so why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, just a question about with sensors, are we seeing better, control isn't necessarily the right word, but fewer lows? Our son has had type 1 for 2.5 years, and we have never, knock on wood, had to use a glucagon.
Yeah.
And it's gotten to the point where we're a little bit lax about carrying it with us all the time. So I was just curious if that's something we're seeing with the sensors, is that is not necessarily as critical because we have warning in advance. Thoughts?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that when the sensors initially came out, I would have said no, they're terrible. But now and of course every batch of sensor has its own variability and issues, but generally speaking, sensors are accurate enough for us to recommend insulin dosing off of. And so and in fact, like meters, the more in range the blood sugar is, the more accurate the sensor is, in fact, in terms of like reporting an accurate number. Okay. So if your sensor is reading 385, you could get a finger poke that's 325. I mean, there's just normal variation at higher numbers. So yeah, I think that, and I think the data has shown this, that my experience and then the studies have shown that they have done a fairly good job at reducing significant hypoglycemic events. Yeah.
I was just going to ask a follow-up related to the hypoglycemia, and then I'm going to sneak in another quick hyperglycemia question. But one is, so that was really helpful to talk about like the tiering of the low blood sugars. I have a question because two of our kids are away across the country at college, and we have like arrangements with them where we follow them, and we have, if it's the middle of the night and they're having it, like we don't really follow their sensor or bug them in the, whatever 18 hours a day where they're awake and managing themselves. But if they're sleeping and we noticed a low, that, we first text, and if they don't text, then we have this sequence. But sometimes because of the pumps and because of the CGMs and because I can follow it across the country and I see that they're flat, if they're 60 and flat, I'm less concerned than I used to be when they were 60. But I also wonder, like, what's the, we generally don't let that sit. Whereas with our son here, who's in our house still, we'll kind of like let it sit because we can intervene. I don't feel as comfortable with that. So them so far away, but I wondered about that, like, because the pumps are, reducing or turning off the insulin. Is there a different comfort level with kind of where you can let them just hang out, and how low is too low for them to just be hanging out, or in terms of, their brain nutrition and whatnot?
Yeah, I would say that I would feel comfortable with that plan. Like I have a lot of um, confidence in the sensors to give us an idea of what the trend is. And I'll often tell families, like, if they're kind of hovering around a low, but their sensor is flat, watch it. Don't necessarily, treat that, because oftentimes they'll come up on their own. The pumps will pause and they'll have a little bit of recovery. 65 is not a bad blood sugar. Right? You and I, who don't have type 1, may have a fasting blood sugar of 65.
Right.
We just define a low blood sugar for somebody with type 1 at higher because we have less luxury around that range. But I don't think a blood sugar of 65 that's flat and within your supervision is a bad tactic. I would hate for you to be chasing that number and then he's, 280 after you treat it, and then you're on that roller coaster of highs and post-treatment highs. Yeah.
And And then if I can just sneak in a hyperglycemia question, our daughter has, she plays a sport for the university that she's at, and she definitely gets adrenaline induced high blood sugars. And it makes her really hard. It makes her really hard to manage her blood sugar when she's competing, especially because she'll spike and be really high and sort of like, dumping insulin for all the reasons you talked about doesn't help. But then she drops rapidly afterwards, and she hasn't been able to figure out, and she's tried like putting herself in exercise mode earlier, so that there, and which I know like maybe would contribute to maybe, so she doesn't put herself in exercise mode. That's our son who has the opposite. He drops low. She doesn't do that because but then the one thing that she's been trying is putting herself in exercise mode for a longer time afterwards, so that even though she's high and that's changing how much insulin it would be correcting her because she's in activity mode, it might prevent the drop. So I just wondered if you have any, if like those adrenaline highs, if you have any tactics for managing those, because those are tricky because they usually end in a real hypo too.
Yeah. I tend, unless it's really affecting performance, and it sounds like she's a collegiate, athlete, I tend to try and let those go and not treat them with insulin, just because that adrenaline or whatever's going on in the body to resist the effects of insulin then wanes after, and then you do have like, okay, now I just have all this leftover insulin that's gonna drop the blood sugar, and then your recovering muscle cells are like hoovering up the remaining blood sugar in this recovery phase. There may be, I generally tell families don't treat the hyperglycemia induced by exercise. Some people do, but if you're having a lot of lows afterwards, it just may be that situation where you're going to have to let those ride. I do like the idea of putting kids who have this, what we call delayed hypoglycemia, which is really real. Like they'll be out in the swimming pool all day or out hiking or a soccer game, and then all night long having low blood sugars. And so I do have families, okay, let's put you in exercise mode, because if you're on the tandem pump, you're don't have a choice. Your target is 110. And that ends up being too much for people who've done that. And then if you're on the Omnipod, you can temporarily change your basal rate and your target, or you can temporarily change your target rate overnight, so it's not trying to correct you down. So I think those are kind of the two biggest tactics, and I don't have insights on how to keep kids from going high with exercise.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's helpful and good to pass on to her. So yes, I see that there's another hand up with Eric and family.
Hi, we've actually experienced the opposite sometimes, where our son's blood sugar level seems normal. He goes to sleep and then it shoots way up. And we're like,
What is
where
going
is that coming
on
from?
with that? Yes, I see that in a certain cohort of kids, and I do not know what's going on, other than there must be some other counter regulatory effect of whatever's going on with insulin. So, for example, we know that kids do a lot of their growing overnight. Growth hormone levels peak and spike overnight. So there may be other things going on that is affecting how sensitive your child is to insulin. And so it can be really tricky to treat. Sometimes I'll have families, if I'm saying, okay, if you see an inflection point on the sensor around that time, go ahead and give them a manual bolus for that upcoming peak and see if we can take the edge off of that rise. It's kind of like a preventive correction, if you will.
Yeah, but you go in and you like try to, we check it before we go to bed at, 10:30, 11:30 at night, and you try to give them a sugar correction and it won't do it.
So
Oh.
I mean, the only way, this is with Dexcom and an Omnipod. So it's not, we used to fake it.
Yeah.
You know, basically you say, well, let's just pretend we gave him 10 grams.
Yeah, we call those
You know, in
ghost
order to
carbs.
get it.
Yeah.
But then that felt like it was training it to expect those carbs, and so that was
Yeah.
counterintuitive. But you know, so we've stopped doing that a long time ago. But even so, it's really frustrating.
It is really challenging. It's really challenging. And I think, yeah, I'm not sure that there's a great way of getting around that with the Omni 5. I mean, yeah, that I see that a lot. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's good.
All right.
Yeah,
Well,
It's not just us.
it's not our, it's
normal,
not
quote unquote normal. Yeah.
yeah, okay. And it's, you know, to your point, the growth hormone connection is probably key there, and that relieves some stress. Thank you.
Well, I hate to interrupt this amazing conversation. It's one of my favorite conversations, but it's 8:02. And we always try to respect everyone's time by calling everyone's attention to the time. We can stick around for a few more minutes, and maybe Dr. Nicol will answer the last few questions anyone has, but I just really appreciate this conversation. It's just been very enlightening, and I just deeply appreciate it. And I hope that you will come back. And we really laid a big one on her. I mean, it's just something that it's something that is at the forefront of, I think, a lot of people's minds, because it's something we base all of our care of our kids on, is this understanding of what are these outcomes and what are we supposed to be doing here. But it changes so fast. So I thank you so much for digging into this and sharing what you know, and the way you presented it was just so perfect. So
Good.
thank
Oh,
you. It will be
that's
useful
helpful.
down the road too. Anyway, thanks everybody. Thank you so much for your time. And we will see you. Oh, next month is all about camp. So this is our annual opportunity to ask questions about camp, what's coming up, meet some of our new staff. We have a great team that's coming together this year, and it's going to be so fun. And of course, Dr. Nicol will be at our camp. So sign up for that week if you have the right age of kid.
Yeah, I'm breaking the camp in. I think Care Bear and I have the first week, so we're
Oh
gonna.
yeah, you got to be a 10th or 11th grader to go to that camp, which my daughter will be there. So yay! Awesome.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Very
Thank you.
helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Dina, the age of starting a camp is second grader. Once they finish second grade, they can come to a week of camp. We do have a kindergarten camp that's a day camp, and a first grader camp that's a single overnight camp with families. So hopefully you're in that group. Feel free to reach out to me at rob@galescreekcamp.org, and I can answer all your questions about camp. I can't wait.
Camp is awesome. Yes.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Good night,
Bye,
everybody. Thank you.
everybody. Thanks.